Evening, everyone. So welcome to, I guess you've been to Cardinal Place before, most of you, but welcome to our offices here at Cardinal Place. If you haven't seen me before, then my name is Mike Ormond. I work in a group called Developer and Platform Evangelism, and our job is basically to talk to people about the great tools and platform that we have as Microsoft. My email address is just mike.ormond@microsoft.com. Feel free to drop me an email. My blog URL is mico.co.uk, which will redirect our blogs.msdn address, just because that's a bit easier to remember. And I think I'll be blogging about a few of the things I discovered along my journey in preparing this session, which has been a bit of an interesting journey. The thing I should make clear is that this isn't all the new features in Beta 2. I think Ravi probably noticed a little bit of reluctance when we first discussed what the topic should be on my part to take what's new in Beta 2 specifically, because there's bucket loads of stuff. Not all of it lends itself terribly well to being demoed. A lot of it's kind of boring nuts and bolts, but useful stuff rather than whizzy, wang bang, great stuff. So I've picked out a few things that I can demo, and I'll touch on a few other important areas, but there's a whole lot of stuff that I just don't have the opportunity to touch on at all. So this is what I want to try and cover in the hour or so that I've got. A bit about new media features, that's just some talking because I can't demo them. A bit about controls and control templating, and specifically the Visual State Manager. A little bit about some changes in networking and data, and then I guess it has changed a bit in Beta 2. It's not new in Beta 2, is this deep zoom capability, which is a nice graphical whizzy thing that you can demo. And there are some new features in there that are quite cool as well, specific to Beta 2. Now, the reason I can't demo any of the new media features is because I'm not running Windows Server 2008, and you require Windows Media Services, Windows Media Server, Windows Media Services in order to utilize these new features. So they're really intended for a full-scale media streaming environment, and unfortunately that's not what I run on my laptop. But the first, and possibly the most important, well, I guess server-side playlist is a long-requested feature, but the most important one I think is going to be around adaptive streaming, and combining that with some of the IIS 7 Media Pack features. There's some new features in IIS 7 for media streaming that are specifically targeted to improving the experience for users, but also for reducing bandwidth costs for those people deploying streaming services. But adaptive streaming is really about taking advantage of the optimum bit rate that your Silverlight client should be consuming at any particular time, depending upon the network load and the CPU load on the machine. So Silverlight will automatically adjust to the appropriate or the most appropriate bit rate that you've published based on what's going on in terms of network traffic and what's going on in terms of CPU activity on the machine. So you can imagine you've got your little Silverlight client running away talking to, let's imagine it's the NBC Olympic site, seeing as that's just about the biggest Silverlight, well, that is by far the biggest Silverlight streaming site that's been produced to date, absolutely huge. And indeed they do take advantage of adaptive streaming in that on that site. So they publish streaming media at various different bit rates. And assuming that you have a fast enough pipe, then optimally you're going to want to consume that 1 megabit stream. And while things are going well, that's going to carry on and you'll be consuming that quite happily. But should something happen on your machine, or should something happen to your broadband connection, with my slightly antiquated busy cursor there, Silverlight will automatically drop down to the most appropriate bit rate, and assuming that things get better, things improve, your CPU utilization goes down, we'll step back up again as well. And that is an extensible mechanism that's in there, so you can go in and effectively modify the rules around when and how you take advantage of those different bit rates. But it requires this ability to publish multiple bitrate files, MBR files, on the server. Sorry, does that mean that you would have to encode for all three different
Yes.
bitrates? So
Yeah.
3,000?
Yeah, so there's physically, this is what this MBR file is. This is a multiple bitrate file, so you physically encode the media at 2, 3, 4, whatever the appropriate number of bitrates are, publish that effectively as a stream from your Windows Media Server, and then the client will choose which is the most appropriate stream to consume. We introduced DRM, Digital Rights Management, in Silverlight 2 Beta 2,
and also server-side playlists. Now that was a much requested feature to date. And I don't know if any of you have seen the Silverlight screencasts that predominantly Mike Talty did, to be fair. He did about 40 of them. I did about 10 of these 50 screencasts that we produced. And one of the challenges we had, because we published it onto Silverlight streaming, one of the challenges is there's a limit of 10 minutes on those videos, around about 10 minutes on those videos. And some of them, it's very difficult to get a particular feature in 10 minutes. So you end up chaining these videos together. There's no mechanism, there was no mechanism to do that by publishing a server-side playlist previously. So Mike wrote some code that basically mechanically hooks that up behind the scenes for us. But now you can publish one of these WSX files, and it essentially is just an XML file that describes the order in which you want media to play at. It's very simplistic. You can do more than that, but essentially it says, I want you to play these files in this order, and once this one finishes, just go ahead and play the next one. So you can publish on the server the order that media should be served. As I say, unfortunately, can't demo any of that as I'm not running Server 2000, or I'm not running Windows Server, and therefore can't take advantage of media services. On the controls front, the big change really in Silverlight 2 Beta 2 is that pretty much everything gets moved into system.windows DLL, and that means pretty much everything is part of the base install of Silverlight 2 Beta 2. So if your customer, client, consumer has Silverlight 2 Beta 2 installed, then they've got the vast majority of the controls required to render your application. Whereas previously, quite a number of controls were in separate DLLs, and you then had to reference them in your application, and that meant a bigger download from an application perspective when the user came to browse your site. The only things that fall outside of that predominantly, DataGrid, which lives in its own DLL, and there are some others, Calendar, Date Picker, some of the less frequently used controls, not lesser controls, but less frequently used controls, live in a separate DLL. But the vast majority now just live in system.windows.dll, and that means that you don't need to reference any additional assemblies in your app for using those controls. That's kind of the big story. There are some changes, particularly in DataGrid's got some enhancements, and I'm sure some of the other controls have some enhancements as well. But the big thing is really about the packaging of them rather than functionality. So, and I've made a bit of an assumption here, I suppose, but it was an inevitable assumption once I'd taken on the topic that most people know a little bit about what Silverlight is and kind of what types of applications Silverlight can build. And I'm hoping that people aren't going, holy, what's he talking about? Yeah, so I'm kind of assuming that you know what Silverlight is all about, which is a shame because that means I don't get to do all the whizzy media demos and everything that we normally do. So there's a level of assumption here that you kind of know what it's about. And I guess there's a level of assumption around you know kind of how the architecture works in terms of controls as well, because I'm going to go on and talk about something called the Visual State Manager. It tends to get a bit nitty gritty once we get down to the XAML involved in that. But essentially, controls are incredibly flexible things in Silverlight, and also in its I suppose its Uber guise WPF as well. You can style them, as you might expect. So you've got a button there, you know, and I can come along and I can say, well, I want to change its background, I want to change its font, and I want to change its font color, and I can change it to look slightly differently by styling it. No surprise there. Kind of odd, I suppose, is the fact that most controls, content controls, aren't restricted to the types of content that they can host. So that there, for example, is a button with two buttons inside it. Not a very practical thing to do, but there is effectively no limit to the sorts of content that you can put inside content controls. So you've got a certain amount of flexibility there in terms of if you wanted a button with, instead of text in it, you wanted graphics in it, and you wanted, I don't know, a little calendar control on the side, you can do that. That's not a problem for WPF or Silverlight. You can also take advantage of styles to build a resource which can be applied across multiple controls. So if you have a particular look and feel that you want for your buttons in your application, you can style it in a particular way, gather that lump together, stick it in as a resource, and then just apply that style to all those buttons, and hey presto, they will all look exactly the same. So you gather your common properties into this style and then bind the style of the control to that style resource. But kind of where we're headed here, and as I say, there's a lot of flexibility, and it does get incredibly confusing, the number of options you have around changing the behavior and the look and feel of controls. Where we're heading is this thing called control templates. Control templates allow you to completely change the look and feel of a control, not the fundamental behavior of that control. So I said here, it might not have feathers, it might not have a bill, but it's kind of still a duck. You forget the reference about duck typing, etc. It is a button, even though you've totally changed the look and feel of that button. It has the behaviors of a button, but how it looks and how it responds to user input may be quite different to what you're used to in terms of a button. So templating allows us to change the appearance and change the visual behavior. That means when I mouse over it, or when I click it, or when it's got focus, things happen. And actually, most of the time, you're not really aware that those things are happening. It's kind of you're so used to it, it's just part of your subconscious. But a lot of things happen in controls as you interact with them. And somehow we have to capture that and incorporate that in the changes we make to controls. The natural consequence of that is once you start to deconstruct your duck, so you take that button apart and say, I don't want the button to look like a sort of rounded corner rectangle with some text in it. I want it to look like, you might have seen the fish button that was done ages ago, and I want it to look completely different. It starts to get quite complicated because people expect that when you mouse over that fish, something happens to indicate that you've moused over it. That might not be the same thing that happens with a standard Windows Forms button or an HTML button. It might be something quite different, but they expect something to happen, and they expect something to happen when they click it. Probably not spinning around as most people show in their Blend and Silverlight and XAML demos. But they expect something to happen, and somehow we have to incorporate those state-driven effects into our control template in order that it becomes relatively easy to manage those transitions of state and make something happen. Now, WPF does this in a particular way. Silverlight Beta 1 did it in a particular way that was quite complicated. Don't know if anybody tried to manage this stuff in Silverlight Beta 1 using the control parts architecture in Beta 1. So what we've done is we've kind of hidden that architecture now, and we've raised it up a level as you do, and tried to make it easier for people to manage and specify the transitions between states of their controls. Now what this diagram shows here is about the simplest control I could find, which is a toggle button. And the toggle button has a variety, I think it was a toggle button anyway, the toggle button has a variety of states. It might be in its normal state, it might be in a mouse over state, it might be pressed, it might be disabled, it might be focused, unfocused, checked, unchecked, or indeterminate if it's a 3-state toggle button. Now the interesting thing about these states is some of them are mutually exclusive and some of them aren't. So I cannot be in normal state and mouse over state or press state at the same time. Those things are mutually exclusive, but I could have the focus and be in normal state, or I could be unfocused and be in normal state. So these things get split out into something called a visual state group, which are groups of mutually exclusive states, in order to reduce the number of permutations you have to worry about when you come to say, I want to specify what happens when I, say, mouse over a button in the disabled state. By factoring these things out into state groups, I can say, well, I don't have to worry about what happens when I go from X state to Y state, when that combination can never happen. So we specify visual state groups as mutually exclusive states, and then we specify what happens in terms of visual transitions when, if we want to, when a particular state is entered. So when mouse over state is entered, I can specify I want a particular animation to run, and for example, the button dims slightly, or the button grows slightly, or the button does whatever it requires. So it all sounds a little bit, I suppose, sounds a bit abstract at the moment, but hopefully you'll get a reasonable idea of what it is I'm talking about when we go in and have a look at a demo. So let's just bring up my control template solution here. And we're not going to worry about the resources at the moment. We'll come back to that in just a second. So here I have the very simplest toggle button with some content in it, and that content says hello, and if we run this, hopefully it builds. We'll have a giant button with hello in the middle of it, and that whole thing there is a giant toggle button. So the first thing we probably want to do is start to apply some properties to that. So this is when I struggle using a lectern because I'm a little bit tall for these things. Width 100, and this is when we could apply something like perhaps the background. So this is our simplest mechanism for styling controls, is to say, let's apply some properties and let's make the background, I don't know, aqua, something along those lines. Now we get a small button with an aqua background on it. Hopefully you can see the colouring of it, it's definitely changed. And it acts as a toggle button. It's the very simplest styling I can do. As I mentioned, you don't have to have simple textual content in here. If I say toggle button content, and we say throw in, I don't know, let's throw in a text box, and set the text in that text box to something. My typing's bad enough as it is without having to sort of lean back and try and see that screen. We've now got a toggle button with a text box in the middle of it. It's not actually terribly functional because it's quite difficult to edit the text in the text box, but you can edit the text in the text box if you tab onto it. So I've got that sort of control as well. A bit of an odd thing to do, probably not the first thing you would do when you're building a new toggle button. Let's put things back the way they were. We are going somewhere with this, honest. So what do we have? Content, hello, something like that. If I want to apply a style, so I want to do something a bit more generic in every toggle button in my, or I want to have multiple toggle buttons in my application looking and feeling in a similar fashion, then I can make use of this resources capability. Now I happen to have stuck these resources in my sort of at the top level in my user control here, and I can define a style, and I give that style a key so that I can go and find it again, and I specify a target type for the style. So I might have styles for buttons, toggle buttons, text boxes, etc., etc. And in that style, I then specify setters and values for the properties I want to that I want to change. So, for example, in here, I won't do it because I've got limited time. But in here, I could say height and width I want to be 100, and what was the other thing we set? The background value I want to be aqua. I can equally well do that in here, and then just simply reference this style from all my toggle buttons to get the same effect that we saw a moment ago. But where we're going with this is to this thing called the template of our toggle button. So I can rip out that toggle button's existing template, which is kind of a set of rectangles with rounded corners, and I can throw them away and say, actually, I don't want toggle buttons to look like that at all. I want my toggle button, if we ignore that for a second, I want my toggle button to be a yellow ellipse with this thing called a content presenter. So we're in a grid here, which basically means lay these things out and they're going to lay on top of one another. So the ellipse is going to be overlaid by this, this content presenter. The content presenter is the mechanism you use to bind, effectively, the content defined down here in my toggle button to what's actually presented in the application. So here I'm saying my content presenter is able to handle different types of content, not just textual content, so it's more generic than something like a text box. And I want to bind, using this template binding syntax, I want to bind the content in the actual consumption of this control. So when somebody specifies a toggle button using this template, bind whatever they've defined as the content into this content property on the content presenter here. Similarly for the alignment, so I've got a horizontal content alignment, a vertical content alignment. That allows me as a consumer of this control to specify those things and those things to be reflected in the style that I have defined. But the essence of this is I get an ellipse and I get a content presenter. And if I reference this style in my toggle button, which I do by saying style equals static resource, do shout out when you see a typo because I'll be making plenty of them. and I'll grab my button style. So when I specify in this toggle button that I want it to make use of that style by referencing that static resource, what should happen is we'll see something that looks quite different. Now, see, I left my mouse in the wrong place there. Let's refresh that. There we go. It's a yellow ellipse, a giant yellow ellipse, with the word hello in it, which is my content that I defined in the control itself. And you'll notice if I mouse over it, it changes to green. It doesn't do anything else at the moment, but you'll notice if I mouse over it, it changes to green, which is my mouse over animation. It's a pretty simplistic mouse over animation, but that's what it's defined as. And that's defined in this thing here, the Visual State Manager, Visual State Groups, which Visual Studio complains about with his little blue squigglies. Visual Studio doesn't yet understand the Visual State Manager, so the reason I've not got the design view up is because it just says, oh, I can't render this, I don't know what it is. Today, in this particular iteration, Visual Studio struggles with this concept of Visual State Manager. The good news is Blend doesn't, so Blend works perfectly well, it's just Visual Studio struggles with it. So in our Visual State Groups, if you recall that slide I had, one back here. We had these visual state groups called things like common states, focus states, check states, and we had various states like normal, mouse over pressed, etc. Here in our Visual State Manager, I specify which state group I'm in. So at the moment I'm in the common state group, and I have a visual state called mouse over. And when this state fires, so Silverlight takes care of this transition for me and identifies when the state is firing, it runs this storyboard for me. And that storyboard is basically a color animation that says target the fill of the ellipse and turn it to green over a period of 0.3 of a second. So I have a way to very easily hook into these state transitions and make things happen on my control. So it's a little bit laborious, as you can imagine. Let's grab this. And let's say, okay, if that's the mouse over state, let's change the normal state to yellow. So put me back to yellow again when we're in the normal state. And if I get my mouse out of the way, we should have a giant button that now does something when I go from one state to the other again. Now, you could imagine that you could carry on handcrafting all that XAML to make this magic happen, but it's a bit tedious, it's a bit laborious. Much easier, in fact, to use Blend, which does understand how to do this stuff. So, Expression Blend is kind of the, I suppose, the design end of the WPF and Silverlight spectrum. So Visual Studio very much about writing code, Blend much more about design and introducing the dynamics, the transitions into the animations, etc., into the application. So if we just create a new project in here, yes, let's call it Silverlight Application 2. And as usual, we're a little bit challenged by the amount of real estate that we have to play with in Expression Blend, but we'll try and do the best we can. Let's put in a toggle button. And we probably don't want it to be quite that big. It can be big, it just doesn't have to be quite that big. So I have a toggle button on my application. What I want to do is to take advantage of the styling and the control templating to turn this into something that no longer looks like a toggle button. It just behaves like a toggle button, and take advantage of this visual state management capability to very easily provide the visual transitions between states. Unfortunately, Blend understands all of that. So to do that, where I start is on the object menu here, there's an edit control parts template option, and I have the option either to create a copy of this, so I can start with something that looks like a toggle button and work with that, or I can create an empty template, which is kind of a brave place to go, because you very quickly end up with not very much to work with. I now have an empty space where my toggle button should be with just a grid in it over here. But notice up in the top left there, I have a list of, see if we can move that down, a list of those various different states with their state groups. So we've got our common states, focus states, check states that my toggle button exposes. Now where Blend is getting that from is that every control defines an explicit contract around about its states. So I can query this control and find out what the states are and what state transitions it exposes. And also around any UI elements in that control that are critical to the functioning of that control. So I've just removed all the UI elements. Were there a UI element in that control that is used for some purpose, perhaps in a state transition, for example, I need to know about that so that I name my equivalent of that the same thing so that the control doesn't break effectively. I think I'm pretty safe in the toggle button that that's not the case, but you need to be aware that there are certain limitations in this, and those limitations are defined by that contract. So you should look at the contract for these controls before you start meddling with them too much. But we can do the same thing that we did a second ago. So what did I have? I had an ellipse in there, and I had a content presenter in there, which I think I have to go and have a look in the library for. So we drop those in, and on my ellipse I can go and set properties, and it becomes very much easier to hook things up in Blend than it is when you're doing it manually in XAML. So behind the scenes in my XAML tab here, clearly all the same sorts of things are going on as we were doing a second ago, albeit in a slightly more complex fashion. So this will start to get quite lengthy once we start defining all those state transitions. So let's pick our ellipse here, and we can say stretch me, and my content presenter, stretch me. Why is my ellipse? It's not occupying the area because it's not on auto. And is my content presenter on auto? Yes, it is. And my content presenter, so we wired up, we did a template binding to the horizontal content and the vertical content alignment. You can do the same thing in Blend. So here we are, if I can find the right panel to move. Down here in our horizontal content, I can wire that up by saying make that a template binding and bind it to the horizontal content alignment, and same here for vertical content alignment. You can see my content is now appearing in the center of this control. So I've created something that looks roughly similar, and this is behind the scenes building up that style for me that I can then go ahead and apply to all the other toggle buttons in my application. Now what's interesting is, because I ripped out all the information I had about a toggle button, I haven't any of these transitions defined, I can go ahead and start defining them in a very simple fashion in Blend. So let's say we wanted the mouse over state. You'll see there's little red marks come up there saying recording is on. So I now specify what I want to happen when I mouse over that control. So say we wanted to turn the ellipse green, which I think was what we did before. Was that what we did before? Something like that. So I want to turn that ellipse green, and I can switch that off. And now, if I run that, it's an instantaneous transition at the moment. I can control the duration of that as well, but rather than me having to go in there and edit the XAML, I've now got a transition very simply from one state to the other by just defining that in the Visual State Manager. Yeah?
Sorry, how much Blend is good for building all interface in one stage or just for similar parts?
Sorry, say that again?
Blend for similar parts, or can I build all interface for my application in Blend? Then
You can build the whole user interface of your application in Blend, yes, absolutely. Visual Studio you need just to write the code behind effectively. So you end up working a bit in both of them. Yeah, it's not just about doing this. Blend is for all the design aspects, if you like, other than the creation of graphical assets, which you need another tool that's more better designed for drawing, etc. Yeah?
So when you did it in the XAML, you had to explicitly define the mouse over and the normal state. But with Blend, you only had to define the mouse over state, and it automatically went back to normal.
Yes.
Normal was automatically defined.
Now that's an interesting question, and we'll probably have to go digging around in the XAML for that, because what I don't know is whether or not, I don't think it has I think you're right, I think there's a default normal state that is just automatically returned to, and that's created by Blend when I say go create me a content template. But I have to have a dig around in the XAML just to make sure.
Can I just ask another quick, you
Sure.
mentioned that you need to look at the contracts for your controls.
Yes.
Where are those contracts defined?
So the MSDN documentation has the contracts for each control defined, and you could do the same thing that Blend does and query it explicitly, but it's all documented on the in MSDN. So let me just pick the pressed state as another place I want to go. So let's take the overall grid, drop the opacity on that down a bit to something like, I don't know, 56% will do fine. And let's go down and apply a transform to that as well. We're running a little bit short of space down here. I want a scale transform, and I want to go to 0.9, 0.9, something like that. Switch that off and run again. And if I click the button now, well, I get the effect, but at the moment I'm doing it instantaneously again. What I should be able to do, and if I pick my press state, let's see if this works for me. Let's specify, let's make something a bit longer than that, 0.5, something like that, run it again. So there you go, you can see I can specify the duration of that storyboard as well as what the storyboard actually applies. And I've got a lot of control over this. If you go down here, you can see that when I add a transition, I can specify I want this to be from every state into the press state, or maybe even going from the press to the stable, press to normal. You could end up spending a lot of time doing this if you really wanted to refine it down to that sort of level. But the important thing here is that Blend understands this concept of visual states. It exposes them to you through the UI there, makes it very easy for you to define those transitions by just hooking them up to the particular visual state transition that you are interested in and specifying the duration of that transition. So that's a very quick introduction to visual state management. As I say, if you want to really dig into it, then the place to go is to go and dig around in the code that Blend has generated as a result of doing that. It's reasonably easy to understand what it's doing. It's just quite verbose in the manner in which XAML describes it.
Does WPF work in the same way?
No. So the plan is to incorporate Visual State Manager into WPF. But today, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody who's more of a WPF person than me, but WPF achieves the same sort of thing using triggers. So you specify triggers in your control, and that trigger then triggers an animation. So you can achieve the same effects, but it's a slightly more roundabout way of doing the same thing, if you like. So the nice thing about this as well is, of course, you don't have to write any code to make this work. So I can define the skin of my control, I can define the behavior of my control in terms of those user interactions without having to write any, enter Visual Studio and write any code whatsoever. So this really aimed at, as well as developers, this is the right tool for doing it, but it also means that designers sitting in this don't have to be confronted with Visual Studio and having to hook up event handlers, which is essentially what you have to do in the earlier versions of Silverlight to make this stuff happen.
So those controls we've seen in Visual Studio are available in Blend, like read and...
Are all the controls available in Blend? Yes, absolutely. So all the controls live down the left-hand side here. If I right-click on there, you'll see all the various layout controls, primitives, text boxes, buttons, etc. all live in Blend as well. Now, I have to admit, Blend is not one of my favourite places to be in a demo, especially not at 1024 by 768. So I'm quite glad to get that over with. It can be quite challenging to use in a demo situation. So the next thing I just wanted to talk about for a little bit was some of the networking and data improvements. I kind of lumped these two things together. Again, it's a bit nuts and boltsy, some of it. You can now do cross-domain sockets calls. So
Prior to Beta 2, you could do cross-domain calls using HTTP web request, web client, but you couldn't do it with sockets. You can now, provided that the relevant policy file is in place. Silverlight implements a policy file requirement for cross-domain requests using HTTP web request or web client or sockets. So you either have to have a Flash syntax cross-domain file on the server, or you need to have the Silverlight syntax cross-domain policy file on the server that says, yes, I accept cross-domain requests. But it does now work for sockets as well as the HTTP protocol. You might be surprised to find now that your code breaks code that you've previously written using something like HTTP web request, because you get called back on a background thread. So all the networking stuff in Silverlight is asynchronous, and you invoke a request and then you pass in a callback handler and you get called back in the callback handler. And prior to Beta 2, you would be called back on the UI thread. So if you were then going ahead and modifying the UI in some way, doing some data binding or something, that was all hunky-dory because you were on the UI thread. You might not be in Silverlight Beta 2. You might well come back, probably will come back on a background thread. So you have to be a bit careful about then touching the UI, or you'll get an exception thrown. And what generally happens is the UI doesn't refresh in the way that you expect it to, because that exception is just swallowed typically. But you need to be careful to dispatch onto the main thread in order to do UI updates, just as you would do in Windows Forms. Improved support for SOAP services. To be honest, the details of this, I know there are some improvements. The biggest change is you can now specify in configuration. You can use configuration files in Silverlight 2 Beta 2 for consuming SOAP services. So you don't have to go and modify code and recompile if your port changes or your contract changes, etc. And enhancements in the form of REST support. Well, one area is ADO.NET Data Services. So we have support in Silverlight for ADO.NET Data Services. I have to clarify that slightly because the release of Visual Studio 2008/.NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1 RTM version breaks the support in Silverlight 2 Beta 2 for ADO.NET Data Services. So if you're still on the beta of the Service Pack, this will work for you. If, like me, you've upgraded to the RTM, it breaks the ADO.NET Data Services consumption in Silverlight because the format has changed slightly. So I'll show you a little bit about ADO.NET Data Services, but I can't show you actually working because it throws an exception at the last moment. The other change is the availability of link to JSON.
When will that
Sorry.
get fixed?
I suspect that will be fixed at release and not before.
Okay.
The noises I hear don't sound like we're going to update that in the immediate
So there won't
future.
be like a beta 3 or anything like that. This next release is going to be the release.
I can't say for sure, to be honest. I don't know. But given that the NBC Olympics has gone live on this as it stands now, and given I haven't heard there have been any major disasters in that space, I'm kind of expecting that there probably won't be another major preview release before we ship. But that's pure supposition on my part, because I'm being recorded apart from anything else. I'm not going to say anything else, but no, genuinely, I don't know. And I suspect they'll probably tie all the loose ends together at release. There's nothing really to stop them fixing it in the meantime. I just don't get the impression that that's going to happen. And we also have this link to JSON capability now versus data contract JSON serializer. Is anybody familiar with data contract JSON serializer? Tumbleweed. So data contract JSON serializer was your friend until link to JSON came along if you wanted to consume JSON data in Silverlight. There are some downsides to doing that, and that's been part of my pain over the last couple of days trying to figure some of that stuff out. So what did I say I was going to talk about? Linked JSON, data contract serialization, network, background threads. Maybe we'll have a look at ADO.NET Data Services as well. Oh, we're not doing very well for time. Maybe as it doesn't actually work. That's not a very sensible thing to
to do, because you're going to wonder why I'm showing you something that doesn't work. So let's go into networking data. Have people seen ADO.NET data? I'll give you a quick summary of what it does. ADO.NET Data Services in action. It's part of Service Pack 1, and essentially it allows you to expose a data context. So it might be linked to entities. It might be an entity framework data context, sorry. It might be a link to SQL data context. In fact, it doesn't have to be either of those, provided it fulfills certain criteria. You can expose this thing as a RESTful service. So, having said I wasn't going to show it, have I actually got it in here? Data services, there it is. So what it allows you to do in this website here, this data services web, I've specified, this happens to be a link to SQL model, so it's a few tables from the Northwind database as a link to SQL model. I've exposed that over data services, and what that lets me do if I start that, actually I should just be able to debug that site. Won't do anything at all, I don't think, at this point, but if I, apart from that break that I stuck in there, if I request webdataservice.svc, that's the endpoint for ADO.NET data services in my application. So I've taken that link to SQL model, which has in it the products, order details, and orders tables from Northwind, and said expose this over a RESTful service. So I can specify using the URL and a well-known syntax to ADO.NET data services that I would like to, in this case, for example, get back the products table, and in atom pub format by default, you get atom pub format, back comes the products table from the Northwind database. ADO.NET Data Services also supports JSON format as well, but by default you get this atom pub format. Now what I can do, having created that service and exposed my data in this way, is that ADO.NET Data Services comes with a tool called Data SVC util, Data Service util, a bit like in the world of WCF, where you can point, what's it called in WCF land? Service util. Is it just called service util? SVC util, thank you. So you point data SVC util at the root endpoint for your service, and it creates a bunch of client-side classes for you that you simply then effectively creates a proxy for you that you then incorporate into your Silverlight application. So you bring that code into your Silverlight application, and it exposes this data inside Silverlight in a very easy to consume fashion, but it doesn't work in Beta 2 right now. But it essentially allows you to manipulate it in a very friendly fashion of this form here. So I specify the endpoint URI for my data service. So I'm now inside Silverlight, I'm trying to consume this thing. There's the endpoint for my data service. I can crank up one of these data context things specifying that URI, and then, and this is where it gets really weird, I can use a link query to query this stuff, but my link query is actually generating a URL of the specific format that ADO.NET Data Services requires. So if I run this, and we step over that, you'll see that if I hover over query, it might be a bit small at the back there, but that's got localhost, blah, 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 data services web, data service.svc products, filter starts with product name A, and that was exactly what my link query did there. It said, I only want the products where the product name starts with A. So it takes that link query, and instead of translating it into some sort of SQL syntax, as you get with link to SQL, here with link to ADO.NET Data Services, you get a URL instead. So the provider for that translates it into ADO.NET Data Services URIs, which is really quite cool. And having said I wasn't going to talk about it, I've just talked about it. So, where was I with the other one? Here we are. So, back in the world of normal networking, here I have
Another little Silverlight application, doesn't do a great deal. But what it does is it's meant to be querying a Yahoo web service. But I didn't feel I could go to Yahoo and ask them to put the policy file on their web service because I doubt they would do that for me. So instead I sort of sucked their data in and made my own handler that exposes effectively a static version of what you might get back from that Yahoo service. So this horrible big string here is a lump of JSON that I got when I queried the Yahoo service for images. So I don't know what the official name of the service is, but you can query it and say, give me all of the images related to VW camper vans is what I asked for. And I got back this big lump of JSON here. What I want to do is consume that JSON in my Silverlight application. And so for our purposes, the fact that I've just implemented that as a handler inside my application, kind of arbitrary, it doesn't matter, it's just because I can't get easily to the Yahoo service. But the way I would typically do that in Silverlight is I go ahead and I create that endpoint URI, and then I create an HTTP web request, and I call begin response and pass in this callback, and then in my callback, I go and I grab the state and I call end get response to get the results, and I end up with this stream that I then have to suck out that JSON code from. Poor English, apologies for that. I have to suck the JSON out of that stream in some fashion. And it's not an easy thing to do. Frankly, it's a right pain in the butt to do it, especially if you use your friend, the, what did I call him, the data contract JSON serializer. The reason it's a pain in the butt if you use data contract JSON serializer is because what you have to have up front is an implementation of the class that you're going to deserialize to. And if you don't know what that class is up front and you have to wade your way through that giant lump of JSON there, you'll end up with grey hair like me. And that's what I did over the last couple of days, and I ended up with this thing. Through a series of trial and error, you'll see that the overall thing that we get is of this type image search result, and hanging off image search result is an image, these are arbitrary names I've given, an image result set, but that's a complex object in itself, and that has an array of image results, another complex object, which I then had to define, and then that has another thing hanging off it called the thumbnail, which I then had to define. And I basically I got to this by creating instances of this class and serializing them and comparing them with the JSON I had from Yahoo and figuring out why there were differences. Maybe that's just me, maybe my JSON familiarity index isn't high enough, but it was quite painful. It does make it relatively easy to consume it now, because I can create one of these data contract JSON serializer. Let's call it a DC.js. And I have to specify that type, which was called VSM1 dot image result set. And having created one of those things, I can deserialize that. So VSM1 dot image result set IR equals DC.js dot read object, and I can pass it that stream, which is called response stream. And hey presto, I now basically have, if I cast it correctly, and I basically have one of those objects, and I can do with it what I will. The trouble is, all the hard work you didn't see me do for the last couple of days, because I had to create that other class that was backing that, and it really was very painful indeed. In order to use data contract serializer, you do have to add a reference. The reference for data contract JSON serializer, in case you wonder how this works, is system.servicemodel.web. But you have an alternative now, which is in this system.json assembly that basically encapsulates some loosely typed JSON objects. So you can do something like JSON object, don't want to cast it yet, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. JSON object JO equals
JSON object.load, and pass in that response stream. And again, we get into a bit of a mess here, because when you start casting things left, right, and center, you will spend your life casting things from one thing to another. That gives me back a JSON object. Again, I don't know much about that object at this stage, but what I can do now, if I get things right, is to say something like var query equals from j in jo. Now I know there's a thing on there called result set, and I know there's a result in there, and I know I can cast that to a JSON array because it's an array of results. That's looking happy. Let k equal, basically I have to start casting things left, right, and center, but it's going to take me ages to type all this in. But basically, I can cast that thing to a string, and I can specify, say I wanted to get the URL out of this for any images that were in JPEG format. I can just very easily start to construct this by saying, let k equal string j, where j dot file type equals JPEG, select whatever it is, j URL. Say I want to get the URL out of it, and then bind that to whatever thing it is I want to bind to. So say I was binding to a data grid. I can, in say 3 or 4 lines of link here, I can go into that JSON object and extract what I want and data bind it, do whatever I want with it, without having to go to the burden of creating an instance of a .NET type that looks like that JSON object, if that's not what I want to do. Clearly, if I'm going to take that type and do lots of things with it, probably data contract JSON serializer is a better route to go down. But if I just want to grab into that and go and get a piece of data out of it, I can just do a link query like this. Yeah, it's a bit ugly because you end up, it's a little bit like link to XML if you've done much with link to XML, in that there's loose typing there, you don't really know what type things are, so you end up casting things left, right, and center. But it's a very quick and easy way to navigate through that JSON object and get some data out of it and do with it what you will. Be aware as well that, say I was down here and I'd got back my result, and just I got back my my result. I'm probably going to have to do dispatcher.begin invoke and start myself off, transition onto the UI thread if I want to update any sort of controls here. So say, for example, originally I was binding this to a data grid. To do that update, I'm going to do a dispatcher.invoke to make sure I go onto the UI thread before I touch that data grid. Similarly, up at the top here, I could, if I wanted to now, make that call to get data. Say this was some time-consuming, long-running calculation here. I could make that call to get data on a background thread as well, and that will make the network request for me on a background thread. That wasn't possible in Silverlight 2 Beta 1. So you can make calls on background threads, and you will get called back on background threads, and you need to be aware of that. Okay, after that small deviation into the world of data services, let's get back to the I don't want you to restart, now's not a good time. Back to the world of PowerPoint for a second. So we have this capability in Silverlight 2 called Deep Zoom, which is based on something called Sea Dragon Technology, a company we bought. And in essence what it does is it takes up images and chops them up into this sort of pyramid fashion, chops them up into smaller images or lower resolution versions of the same image, if you like, constructs them as sets of tiles, and then presents them to the user at a kind of optimum resolution, if you like, based on its representation it has in this pyramid structure. So if I'm zoomed away out in the image, rather than me getting the whole of this high-res image down, I just get that little tile at the top until I start to zoom in, and then Deep Zoom starts to present me with the tiles required in order to produce a higher res image. People have seen Deep Zoom in action, yeah? So the best place to go and see it probably is the Hard Rock Cafe's memorabilia.
website. I won't show you it, but go to the Hard Rock Cafe's memorabilia site. It's very cool. And it does clever things with metadata as well. So when you're panning around and zooming in on it, it presents to you information about where you are in that giant array of all their memorabilia. The changes for Beta 2 is it's now an XML-based format that represents all the metadata that Deep Zoom uses to figure out where you are in this thing and which tiles to present, etc. And also we exposed a new extensibility point, if you like, called multi-scale tile source. So in Silverlight 2 Beta 1, all you could do was take a static image or a set of static images, or you could do some very clever things you wanted to do. But essentially you took a static image, a set of static images, ran them through some pre-processing, and then handed that over to Deep Zoom and it rendered it for you. Now you can do this dynamically if you choose to, using multi-scale tile source, where Deep Zoom will come to you and say, give me the tile at this level for this position. And you say, it's probably that one, and you hand it back. At least that's my experience of it. Now, we've struggled to find a use for this, to be honest, which makes me wonder why I spent so long trying to make it work, because I can't figure out what you might use it for.
Minority Report screen.
Sorry?
Screen from Minority Report.
So I'll show you in action in a second, but essentially Deep Zoom in Silverlight is implemented by this thing called the multi-scale image control. That's the control you put on in your Silverlight application in order to render Deep Zoom imagery, and you do the pre-rendering up front with something called Deep Zoom Composer. And, oops, let's just fire up Deep Zoom Composer, but I won't have time to go through the whole rendering process. Not that it's long-winded for one or two images, but it can be a little bit time-consuming. But I'll give you an idea of what's going on, if that project will load. Ooh, there we go. Nice weather and sky, which must be somewhat rare. This is Deep Zoom Composer. Basically, it allows me to take sets of images, drag them onto my canvas, lay them out in a way that I choose, so I can. One of the things you often see with Deep Zoom is people will go and take a really high-res image all the way in here, say, and then you stick that image on there, you get it all lined up nicely, and you can drill into and into these Deep Zoom images. And the way Deep Zoom represents the data means that it only stores the high-resolution imagery about that particular point and not about the whole array of images that you have in there. The other thing that's new in Deep Zoom Composer is you can say, oh, that's a panoramic photo. This might not work. I don't know if I selected the right images, but it should lay them out automatically for me if I've picked the right three images, which were sort of a panoramic photo. But basically, I go through this process, laying them out, and then I export them in, there you go, in the special. So that's like another thing out of Microsoft Research, this automatic stitching capability. But I lay these things out, I go into export, and I can either upload directly to PhotoZoom now, so that's an online hosting part of the Windows Live family, or I can, in here, say, create me a project called blah-de-blah, and export me this as a full Silverlight application. So the nice thing it does for you now, that multi-scale image control that I mentioned doesn't do any of the nice panning and zooming stuff that you'll experience if you go to the Hard Rock Cafe site. It just sits there. So you wire it up and you point it at some images and it just sits there, and you have to write the mouse wheel handler and all that stuff yourself. This spits it all out for you. All that code just gets spat out by Deep Zoom Composer. So if you're building anything to do with multi-scale image, even if you're not using this as your input, I suggest you go here and just nick the mouse handler code out of this thing. But it spits it out for you as a Silverlight application, and you can then just run up that application and it will work. I mentioned it also exports to Live Labs, PhotoZoom at Live Labs, and my internet connection's gone down. Oh. Why is it that we have the most, from a presenter's perspective, the most unreliable internet connection in our own facilities? So at PhotoZoom, it uses that same technology. Let's pick the right one. And you can just upload photos to this, so you don't need to do anything else other than upload a bunch of photos.
and it will then use the Deep Zoom Composer technology to create for you a deep zoom representation. So I happen to have a lot of photos of what was my camper van, it isn't anymore, and I uploaded them all, and PhotoZoom just creates this deep zoomable image for me, so I can drag it around like you can with any deep zoom thing, and you can zoom in and notice the way that it, oh, that's probably a bad place to pick there. Notice the way that it gradually improves, the quality of the image as you zoom in. It gradually pulls down those tiles and improves the resolution as you go. It's really quite a cool, that might be a more interesting place to look at. It's really quite a cool technology, and as I say, that just does it all for you. You just upload to Live Labs, and it works. It's quite cool. Now, coming back to this dynamic capability that Deep Zoom now has, this is where we struggled to find an application for it. So I thought quite a nice application for it would be Mandelbrot set, because that's quite visually interesting. And this is where I ended up tearing my hair out, because it's very poorly documented at the moment how this works, and it's not intuitive in the slightest. So trying to get your head around when it comes to you and says, I would like tile at tile level 7 at this position, figuring out what tile to render is nigh on impossible, I would say, unless you have a little bit of inside knowledge. But here we have Mandelbrot set. Now the interesting thing about this is it's being rendered dynamically, so as I zoom in, you may or may not be able to see that, but it's increased. There is a finite limit to how far it will render. But I'm not rendering that image at infinite quality at the outset. I'm getting different tiles, getting requests from that multi-scale image control saying I want this tile at this level, and I'm going ahead and rendering that and passing it back to the client, and it's then patching those together. And it quite cleverly manages to stitch those together through the various different transitions involved in going from one zoom level to the next. If you want to see a little bit about how it works, in a simpler version than that, I would say Mike Talty wrote an application that lets you see it happening. What it doesn't do is stitch together the different layers, and therefore it's not actually, I didn't find it very useful for actually figuring out how to make the layers all line up. But what it does do is show you the various transitions that are going on. So you can specify an overall width and height for your image, a tile size. So if we drop the tile size down to say something like 16 and recreate it, you'll see you get loads and loads of little tiles being generated, and as you zoom down and zoom back up, what he's doing is rendering. Oh, that doesn't actually, might be a bit of a rendering issue with his app there. It renders the tile level that you're at. So we're at tile level 8, and then as you zoom down, it will switch to 9. Obviously, they're quite small tile sizes, so the processing overhead now is quite high. If I go back out again, it should go back to 7, back to 6, etc. What you have to do is give that multi-scale image a URL, which will give back to you, basically will render for you a PNG, JPEG file, whatever, at the appropriate position in that image at the appropriate tile level. And that's something I'm definitely going to do some posting on that, because I've spent a fair amount of time with Mike's help trying to figure out how it works to get that Mandelbrot thing working. The only actual use of it I have seen so far is this one here, which is wrapping up virtual earth mapping capability in Silverlight. So I think this was started off by a partner in Australia called Soul Solutions, wanted to get this working. They're sort of virtual earth people. And so this is running inside Silverlight, and you can fly about in here. It's quite a responsive app, as you can see. And that's using that deep zoom capability, talking to that class, the multi-scale tile source class, that's the one, asking for particular tiles. Now the advantage is, of course, virtual earth tiles things anyway, so they just go to virtual earth and say, give me this tile. Not saying it's trivial, but it lends itself very well to that, because virtual earth by its very nature has tiled images to supply. So that deep earth capability, it's on Codeplex, definitely worth a look if you are interested in that capability. Whew, that was a bit whistle stop, wasn't it? With that, I'm just going to leave you with a few
URLs. I know they're very long, but I guess these slides get distributed, published, made available somehow. The general stuff, Scott Guthrie's blog, that's got the specific changes between beta 1 and beta 2. There's also good documentation on MSDN, which is that horrible URL there on what's changed between beta 1 and beta 2. There's some good stuff from Karen Corby on controls, specifically in the Visual State Manager. And Mike's blog, as he published that code showing you kind of how things work in terms of the transitions between different tile levels with multi-scale image and that dynamic tile source capability. The other thing I would say, I'll give a plug for Remix. If you're interested in this stuff, if you're interested in Silverlight, if you're interested in Live, if you're interested in in design, in expression, any of those sorts of technologies from Microsoft, then 18th to 19th September down in Brighton, we've got a 2-day conference called Remix UK, and it would be terrific to see you there. We've got some great speakers there, including Scott Guthrie, Bill Buxton, and Mike Tolty's actually doing a session. Jesse Liberty's coming along as well to do at least one session on Silverlight. So with that, I'll say I've overrun slightly. Apologies for that. I'll say thank you very much. I'll get off so you can get a cup of coffee. I think Paolo is coming in. Is Paolo here? I saw him earlier, but I think Paolo's coming in to talk about mesh after this, is he? Thank you very much indeed.